Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Birkbeck this evening. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and it's a great pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Ben Gidley. Ben is, as it were, one of our own. He is Reader in Sociology and Psychosocial Studies here at Birkbeck, and is a research associate of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. His books include Turbulent Times, at the British Jewish Community Today, which was published in 2010, Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe, a shared story, which was edited with James Renton and published in 2017, and most recently with Sami Everett, Jews and Muslims in Europe, Between Discourse and Experience. Ben, I think I'll say, combines an unusual set and a rather wonderful set of attributes. He's both a leading social researcher who combines social research with a commitment to political change. He is at home in social theory, but also passionate about ethnography. And he is interested in the past and present of anti-Semitism and in the past and present of racism. There are many people who combine one of these couplings, but to combine all three really is extremely rare. And it's not least for that reason that I greatly look forward to his lecture this evening, which is anti-Semitism a form of racism, and what does the answer mean for anti-racism? Ben.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. It's good to see some old friends and previous students and familiar faces in the crowd, so that's really nice. So the spoiler alert is that the answer to this first question is yes, and that the second question I'm still not sure of the answer to, so we might reach that at the end in a sort of stumbling way. But this is a kind of a question, I suppose, that I've been thinking about a lot for a while, and although I've got a definite answer yes to the first question, I'm still kind of unsure about exactly how that works. And so this is kind of I know it's very habitual to say this is a kind of work in progress, but this is a kind of an ongoing project that I'm kind of thinking and rethinking. So I very much welcome your thoughts and criticisms and so on. I'm going to start with probably an incident that's familiar to most of you, which is the letter that Diane Abbott wrote to The Guardian back in April in response to an op-ed by Tom O'Leary, a young black British commentator who in turn was writing about a new report published that month by the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity at Manchester University about current experiences of racial equality, which had some perhaps surprising findings that I'm going to return to later, that led O'Leary to kind of highlight racism against Irish, Jewish and traveller people as something particularly politically pertinent. And Diane Abbott responded in a letter that she later said was a kind of first draft, and she sort of withdrew. And I'm not putting this up here to kind of to criticise her, but I think it's a really interesting, it's an interesting line of thought, and I think it's a line of thought that is not by any means unique to Diane Abbott. She's a senior Labour politician, for those of you who don't know, who's kind of a veteran of anti-racist struggle in the UK, and been a kind of key figure in the fight for racial justice in Britain. And so her kind of words, I think, are important. And so anyway, what she said was, "Oh, a lady claims that Irish, Jewish and traveller people all suffer from, scare quotes, racism. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they're interchangeable." And she goes on, "It's true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. They're not, in pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote. And at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships." So Abbott was kind of criticised for lots of parts of this, in particular for kind of a historical account that kind of missed out, that included a couple of kind of key 20th century examples, but missed out the Holocaust. But I think that lots of people, even while they criticised her words, argued that there was at least a grain of truth in what she said, in identifying something specific and something urgent about structural racism, which profoundly affects the life chances of visibly racialised minorities today, measurable, for example, in outcomes from institutions where one can assume that staff and managers don't hold explicitly prejudiced attitudes, such as educational institutions. And also that this structural racism is different from something like negative stereotyping, which might be unpleasant but isn't harmful in the same kind of sticks and stones way that structural oppression is. And at the same time, I think many of those that criticised her clumsy wording were happy to accept the premise that Jews, like Irish and traveller people, are white. And this is something that I'll return to later as perhaps one of the kind of problematic aspects of this. More recently, this week in The Guardian, I don't know if people read this sharp and important intervention by the anti-racist activist Erin Kundnani, someone that I've been heavily influenced by over the years. His article focuses on anti-racism rather than racism, and he doesn't explicitly mention anti-Semitism, but I think his article returns to some of the themes in Abbott's, that are in Abbott's letter as well. He contrasts two traditions of anti-racism, one that he calls a liberal tradition and one that he calls a radical tradition of anti-racism. I won't read out the whole quote, but he talks about the liberal tradition of anti-racism as seeing racism as a matter of irrational beliefs and prejudices, and he identifies it with its founders, the anthropologist Ruth Benedict, mid-20th century American anthropologist who wasn't Jewish but was married to somebody Jewish and was often identified as Jewish, and the gay rights pioneer Magnus Hirschfeld, who kind of one of the earliest key theorists of racism. And he notes that they were interested in understanding the rise of Nazism in the 1930s, and they concluded that racial prejudice is a kind of danger to liberal societies and can be corrected by education, by the kind of liberal establishment persuading the masses to overcome their unenlightened opinions. The radical tradition, on the other hand, he says, sees racism as a matter of how economic resources are distributed across racial groups. So he mentions this, an article by the great Trinidadian Marxist writer C.L.R. James on racism in Africa, which talks about racism as a structure rather than something to do with individual attitudes. Individual racist attitudes existed but weren't the decisive factor. And he goes on to also quote Frantz Fanon, Martinican psychiatrist writing in the 1950s, who called for an abandonment of the idea that racism is just a disposition of the mind or a psychological flaw, that it's actually something systematic that can carry on even when the majority of people don't have conscious or unconscious racial biases. I mean, I would sort of quibble about the idea that Fanon was kind of anti-psychological. Fanon's argument was very kind of psychosocial, in that he saw kind of the individual psyche and social structures very bound up together and wouldn't recognise that distinction between prejudice and structure. But I think what's interesting here is the kind of structure of what Kundnani says, which echoes the structure of Diane Abbott's point, which contrasts kind of real racism, structural racism, grounded in economics, to mere prejudice, which is psychological and an individual or personal matter. The real racism is identified by black Marxists, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, whereas the prejudice was studied by basically by liberals, white liberals, many of whom were Jewish. And the paradigmatic form of racism in this structure is anti-black racism, tied up with apartheid, civil rights, kind of Jim Crow segregation in the American South, and transatlantic slavery, whereas the paradigmatic form of prejudice in this model is anti-Semitism, of which the exemplar is the Nazi Holocaust. So there's a kind of real massive binary being set up in these accounts. What I'm going to do in this talk is kind of explore, I guess, how this binary came about and how tenable it might be. And in particular, I would argue that in the current moment, this binary has created a politics which is a politics of competitive victimhood, where prioritising one of those forms of racism, or designating one of those forms as the real racism, by definition kind of means that the other one can't be taken seriously. I haven't actually read David Baddiel's Jews Don't Count or watched the Al Jazeera documentary, the Labour Files, but I think that they're kind of, whether or not they're good examples of what I'm talking about, then the way that they've been taken up in the political discourse are very good examples of what I'm talking about. On the one hand, a kind of demand for anti-Semitism to be counted in a way that kind of can often diminish from other forms of racism being counted, and on the other, an insistence that anti-Semitism is given too much airtime as part of a hierarchy at the top of a hierarchy of racism, and needs to be kind of knocked off its pedestal in favour of the real racism. So this kind of politics of competitive victimhood, I think, is the defining feature of the relationship between anti-antisemitism and anti-racism in our current moment. And as Paul Gilroy said back a couple of decades ago, the wrangle over which communities have experienced the most ineffable forms of degradation is both pointless and utterly immoral. I think there's something really problematic about this kind of competitive racism in the way that it kind of both undermines the possibility of solidarity as well as being fundamentally immoral. I think it's also empirically untenable, and I think it's worth going back to the text that provoked the article that provoked Diane Abbott's letter, which was this study, the racism and ethnic inequality in a time of crisis, by Nisa Finney and colleagues, which was quite a large-scale interview-based study of people from a very large number of racialized minorities in the UK, and their experiences of different forms of racism before and during the period of the COVID pandemic. And the report, and it shows that in some ways Abbott is right. She's right to highlight that some racialized groups, in particular many Black and South Asian groups, are massively more likely to experience differential outcomes in kind of key aspects of their lives and livelihoods, and fundamental structural disadvantages. On the other hand, Tom O'Lady is right to note that the findings show that Jews, Irish people, people of Gypsy, Roma and traveller backgrounds also experience the serious negative effects of racism, both in terms of violence and harassment on the street and in their everyday lives. And the study also revealed that UK Jews, while advantaged in some areas of life, according to some indicators, on Jews as on aggregate rather than kind of each and every individual Jew, but that this was not straightforwardly the case, and certainly not compared to all minoritized groups. So just as a couple of examples, so Jews did report a stronger sense of belonging in Britain than many other groups, but less than, for example, Arabs. Jews reported more regular participation in ethnically specific activity than many groups, including, for example, Africans. While the British Jews were less likely to have been stopped by the police than black British respondents, they were exactly as likely as Indian, Bangladeshi and Arab people. And in general, their reports of explicit discrimination have quite similar levels to people from most South Asian groups. I've got quite a long list of things here in terms of higher levels of bereavement during COVID, higher levels of housing precarity during the pandemic, along with Roma, some Asian groups, similar kind of housing situations to many Asian groups, particular kind of labour market disadvantages, and then most starkly and importantly, the point that our lady was highlighting, significantly higher levels of harassment and violence kind of in their everyday lives. So 2/3, I think, had experienced violent attacks, physical attacks on them, their bodies or their property, rather than verbal attacks, and they were the most scared of future discrimination, along with Chinese and Gypsy traveller people, who were the three groups that experienced the biggest surge in attacks during the pandemic. So I think there's something important here about teasing out what's the relationship between these aspects of structural discrimination, structural disadvantage, on the one hand, and the kind of structures of racism that might lead to street violence and harassment on the other. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my time is just try and say a little bit about how we can make sense of this gap between the understandings of anti-Semitism and understandings of racism, and how we might kind of respond to it. And I'm going to go through three moments. First, I'm going to talk about the mid-20th century moment, when I think anti-Semitism was very much understood as a form of racism, when that binary structure that I set up at the beginning didn't exist, and then talk about what we've described, Brenda McGeever and David Feldman and I have described as kind of parting of the ways in the late 20th century between these two forms of racism and two forms of anti-racism. And then finally, I'll try and say something about what resources we might have for finding a way back. So the mid-20th century moment. Bell Hooks, the late African-American feminist, writing in 1992, said the following: growing up in the segregated South of the United States, the fundamental lesson that I was taught via the Black Baptist Church was that Jews all over the world had suffered exploitation and oppression, and that we identified with them and took their struggle to be our own because of shared experience. Most importantly, we were taught that anti-Semitism and anti-black racism were fundamentally connected. One could not be raised in hardcore Klan territory and not be aware of that connection. It was deeply embedded in our consciousness as Southern blacks. So what she's talking about there, she grew up in the 1950s in Kentucky. What she's talking about is a kind of historical moment when anti-Semitism and anti-black racism were seen as fundamentally connected. This was the case both within scholarship and within the anti-racist movement. And I think that kind of mid-20th century moment when she was growing up in the 1950s was the kind of high point of that moment. I'm going to just talk about three kind of intellectual currents that exemplify that understanding of a fundamental connection between anti-black racism and anti-Semitism. And the first one is the one that's referred to by Kundnani when he talks about the beginnings of the liberal anti-racist tradition, largely attached to the discipline of anthropology from the 1930s onwards. This is really where the word racism in the English language comes from. The first published book about racism in the English language was by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a kind of sexologist. He was a socialist, but not a particularly radical socialist. He was very radical in his opinions about sexuality, and that's what he's been most influential in relation to. But he also, in response to the rise of Nazism, wrote several essays in German that were translated into English and published after he died in 1938 by Victor Gollancz in a book called Racism. And that book was a book that really put the word racism into the kind of scholarly discourse of in the English-speaking world. It was a word that actually started out in French in the 1920s, mainly to refer to kind of German, the rising kind of racial nationalism in Germany, and very rapidly was taken up in German by German activists and scholars experiencing the rise of Nazism before entering English. This idea was very influential on the then already kind of veteran anthropologist Franz Boas, who's kind of one of the key figures of American anthropology, who came from a Jewish background, although didn't identify as Jewish, and some of his students, such as Ruth Benedict and Ashley Montague. And for them, Nazi anti-Semitism was the kind of paradigmatic form of a sort of pseudo-scientific faith that falsely inferred cultural and moral significance and hierarchy from arbitrary biological differences, and that's how they saw racism. Boas had been kind of moving towards this idea for quite a long time before he started using the word racism. In 1909, he gave a commencement speech at Atlanta University, which was then a black college in the South. He was invited by the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois to give this address. Commencement, that's when, like, talking to the, I think it's to the graduating students when they go out into the world. So it's an audience of black students, black graduates from a Southern university. And Boas made a speech where he proposed that the significant differences between human groups were the product of inequality, discrimination, and segregation, rather than the grounds for inequality, discrimination, and segregation. That is, inequality, discrimination, and segregation precede the differences between, significant differences between human groups. And he said, the best example of this is that of the Jews of Europe, a people slightly distinct in type. The separation of the Jew and the Gentile was enforced for hundreds of years, and very slowly only with the various occupations open to him. And then only very slowly did the differences in customs and ideals begin to vanish. Even now the feeling of inequality persists as a kind of lingering consciousness of the old, sharper divisions which the ages have not been able to efface. And which is strong enough to find, not only here and there, expression as antipathy to the Jewish type. So he's saying that anti-Semitism is a result of, and the differences between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbours were primarily a result of anti-Semitism, a result of the kind of enforced separation, rather than the cause of anti-Semitism. And then he concluded this passage, I remember this is aimed at African-American students. He says, I dwell on this example somewhat fully because it illustrates the conditions that characterize your own position. So he's arguing that the history of anti-Semitism in Europe is a key to understanding anti-black racism in the Americas. So this kind of Boasian anti-racism, which sees anti-Semitism as the kind of paradigm of racism and as a form of racism intimately related to anti-blackness, was later formulated in the 1938 American Anthropological Association pamphlet Science Condemns Racism, co-written by Boas, and the UNESCO Statement on Race of 1950, mainly authored by Boas' student Ashley Montague. And it was echoed in Britain by the early race relations sociology of Michael Banton, who saw anti-black racism as springing from the same sources as anti-Semitism, prejudice and bad science. So this is kind of key part of that story of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism being seen as fundamentally connected, both for scholars and for activists who are confronting the rise of Nazism and American segregatory racism. The second intellectual current in this mid-century moment is that of the Frankfurt School, which again was kind of wrestling with the rise of fascism in Central Europe, and saw Nazi anti-Semitism again as the kind of paradigmatic form of racism. So writers like Theodor Adorno, Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, Max Horkheimer, a whole bunch of authors that were published in this series sponsored by the American Jewish Committee, which was about what they called racial and religious discrimination, which they saw as fundamentally the same thing. They published a series called Studies in Prejudice that includes classics such as The Authoritarian Personality, which argues that racism is a kind of, they kind of analyze the social psychology of racism as a form of prejudice, as something that gets embedded in personality, but is linked to practices in the real world that have material effects in a capitalist society. So it's not a purely psychological theory, but very much kind of socially grounded kind of position. And I'll just give a sales pitch for Marcel Stut's book, Critical Theory and the Critique of Anti-Semitism, coming out in I think a month or two, which kind of looks at this tradition in detail. I'm going to move on though and spend a bit more time on this third intellectual tradition that was key in that moment, which is much more heterogeneous than the previous two, which I'm just calling a kind of anti or post-colonial thought. Thinkers such as Du Bois, who I've already mentioned, Frantz Fanon, who Nani mentioned, Hannah Arendt, Albert Memé, Aimé Césaire, Jean Amory. Thinkers, some Jewish, some black, who were thinking about the relationship between colonialism outside Europe, European colonialism in the global south, and what was going on in the heart of Europe, the concentration camps and ghettos of the European continent, and how these things were related to each other. And their conclusion was, again, that there was a kind of fundamental intimacy between anti-black racism, colonial racism, and anti-Semitism. The African-American sociologist Du Bois, writing for a Jewish publication in 1952, described the effects of his several visits to Europe over the years, first as a, I think, PhD student to Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, then to Germany again during the rise of fascism, and then once again after the war, where he saw the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he said that the result of these visits was not so much a clearer understanding of the Jewish problem in the world, as it was a real and complete understanding of the black problem. In the first place, the problem of slavery, emancipation, and caste in the United States was no longer in my mind a separate and unique thing. So Brian Chiette, who's written a lot about this kind of the relationship between post and anti-colonial thinkers and Jewish thinkers in this period, says it is now widely recognized that in the years immediately after World War II, anti-colonial thinkers such as Fanon, Memé, and Césaire routinely included the aftermath of Nazism in their analysis of colonialism, and that those who were imprisoned in the Nazi concentration camps, such as Primo Levi and Jean Amory, looked in part to the victims of colonialism to understand their experiences. So these writers were thinking relationally about racism, about anti-Semitism and colonial racism. Césaire described a boomerang effect between the two. And similarly, Hannah Arendt, in her monumental work on totalitarianism, published in the 1950s, I think the original title was going to be Racism, Imperialism, Totalitarianism, rather than the origins of totalitarianism. which is its published name, and she argues that racism was, colonial racism was a kind of fundamental building block of 20th century totalitarianism. So this moment, during this moment, this kind of mid-20th century moment, I think as modern anti-racist activism emerged in the UK, the struggle against anti-Semitism and the struggle against the anti-black racism experienced by the kind of Windrush generation of migrants were seen as basically the same struggle. The forms of racism they experienced were seen as basically the same. British Marxist sociologist of race, Robert Miles, talking about 1958. 1958 was the year of the Notting Hill riots. So Oswald Mosley, who'd focused in the 1930s on Jewish migrants, kind of fascist leader who focused on Jewish migrants before the war, kind of became active again in the 1950s, focusing on post-colonial migrants while retaining the kind of core, the anti-Semitic core of his fascist ideology. Was one of the inspirations between violent racist attacks on Caribbean people in West London, described in the media as race riots, as if race kind of causes riots. Robert Miles, reflecting back on that, said the idea of race, in this concept of race riots, was employed to interpret the West Indian presence because of their colonial origin. The idea of race was the medium and measure of their difference, and for many of their inferiority. As ex-colonial subjects, there was a reservoir of ideology resulting from the colonial experience, which was available as a means for conceptualizing them. And so basically Miles identified that the kind of forms of thinking structured by race, which the kind of classic, the texts that I've just been talking about, used Nazi anti-Semitism as their kind of sources of reflection, were playing out in the colonies and then brought to the UK with kind of mass black migration after the war. And so there's again this kind of idea of a fundamental intimacy. And some of the key kind of founders of many of the anti-racist movements and organisations that are still with us now, and some of the important anti-racist discrimination legislation that we have, were also kind of trained and formed in this historical moment. This is from a BBC the show called The Reunion, which looks at some of the people that wrote the Race Relations Act of 1976, which is the kind of key anti-racist legislation that's that kind of governs it's the basis of equality law in the UK. And one of its authors was Anthony Lester, who reflected back a quarter of a century later. He said, "My involvement with the vexed problems of racial injustice, bigotry and intolerance began long before 1976. My involvement was shaped by my origins and experience, by the nightmares of a fortunate British Jew who escaped the Nazi Holocaust only by the accident of birth in Britain, by English anti-Semitism, by revulsion at the Sharpeville massacre, the indignation at apartheid in South Africa, by his experience of the civil rights movement in the US, and informal patterns of racial discrimination in the American North." So he's talking about, again, this kind of fundamental relationship between English anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism, and anti-black racism. I think this picture also maybe complicates Kundnani's kind of distinction between liberal and radical forms of anti-racism. These figures were kind of both facing towards kind of liberal strategies of reforming the law to combat discrimination, while also engaged. Deepak Nandi, Lisa Nandi's father, was involved in various Marxist movements in Britain, also involved in kind of much more what we would see as part of the radical anti-racist tradition. So what happened after that? So as I said before, Brendan and David and I talk about the parting of the ways that happened kind of from the late 1950s, in particular from the 1960s onwards, that's led to the current situation of competitive victimhood, where the two are seen as fundamentally different. I'm going to identify, I think there's lots of things that happen, lots of drivers of that parting of the ways, but there's, I think, 5 of them which I'm going to talk about in particular. And the first is a kind of USification of anti-racism, and I think that's kind of there in the chronology of Anthony Lester's account of how he came to the his journey to anti-racism, where the kind of civil rights struggle was a kind of key stop in that journey. That from the period of the civil rights movement, segregation in the American South became kind of the looming kind of form of racism that people were reflecting on, and as the Holocaust kind of receded in time, more and more kind of the civil rights struggle to kind of took on that role. Subsequently, the kind of dominance of American kind of forms of politics, kind of globally echoing, has kind of significantly changed the way that racism is understood in the UK and Europe and elsewhere. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, writing with W.E.B, talks about this as a kind of form of cultural imperialism, where American ideas of racism have kind of been globalized in a way that flattens some of the particular experiences and histories of racism in Europe, for example. And this is a point that Paul Gilroy's often made as well. Gilroy says the self-conscious importation of approaches informed by racial and ethnic situations elsewhere, in particular in North America, which has stood for too long as the sole legitimate measure of Britain's racial future. So that's kind of one factor, this kind of US influence on how we understand racism and anti-Semitism. And fundamentally related to this is, I think, is the idea of whiteness, which is the kind of central principle of that American discourse, where a very particular kind of racial settlement which centres on this binary difference between black and white is the kind of driving force of much American racism, has been kind of globally circulated. And in that understanding, Jews are typically seen as white, and if they're seen as white, then they can't be seen as targets of racism. They must be beneficiaries of racism. And so I think that kind of critical race theory has often been blind to anti-Semitism because it doesn't fit into the kind of paradigm of white supremacy and white privilege. On the other hand, I think many of the kind of European-grounded scholars of anti-Semitism, although they kind of understood that there was a fundamental connection between anti-black racism and anti-Semitism, were unable to kind of see the depth and seriousness of anti-black racism in America. And so Hannah Arendt's essay, Reflections on Little Rock, where she criticizes the movement against segregated schools in the American South in the 1950s, which she was kind of fundamentally unable to understand. She saw the desire of black Americans to go to white schools as kind of equivalent of the social climbing that Jews in Europe had kind of practiced to try and assimilate. So there was a kind of, on both sides, a kind of inability to understand based around this kind of black-white binary. Third, as anti-Semitism kind of became an object of scholarly study in the post-war, post-Holocaust period, it became increasingly institutionalized, especially in North America, in the kind of area of Jewish studies and divorced from areas, sociology and so on, where ethnic and racial ethnicity and racism were discussed more generally. And so it was often linked much more to Holocaust studies and delinked from the study of other forms of racism. And then, I think this might be the last one, I think over the same period there was a shift of emphasis in the scholarship on racism from social psychology towards structure and institution. A really key text in this is this book, Black Power, by Stokely Carmichael, subsequently Kwame Ture, who described institutional racism as a form of racism that happens in the kind of structure of society independently of the presence or absence of personal prejudice. So he talks about he says when a black family moves into a home in a white neighborhood and is attacked, they're victims of an overt act of individual racism, which most people will condemn. But there's also an institutional racism that keeps black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploitative slumlords. And society either pretends it does not know of this latter situation or is in fact incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. The kind of forms of covert racism that are kind of wired into society. And this kind of analysis, which is extremely important in understanding how racism works outside psychology, also kind of pushed the understanding of racism towards a focus on power and privilege. And again, as Jews kind of no longer fitted so neatly into that model, anti-Semitism became harder and harder to understand in that context. And then finally, I think colonialism and particularly I think in Britain and in Europe, colonialism as a kind of key metaphor for understanding racism also kind of has less space for understanding the experiences of some minorities that have been present in Europe for a long time, such as Jews and Roma people. It's a point that Nero Yuval Davis has made many times over the years. And of course part of that is Israel-Palestine, which is the kind of overwhelming political situation that kind of overshadows all of these events, with Israel being seen as one of the colonial powers, seen as a kind of a white nation, perhaps aligned with apartheid South Africa, and again that making it harder to see anti-Semitism alongside anti-black racism as a kind of early indicator of how Israel would become a kind of feature in this, The Parting of the Ways. This is a poem by W.E.B. Du Bois from 1956. In the wake of Suez, he'd been quite supportive of Israel before Suez, and that kind of made him rethink things. And there's a line in there in which he basically blames Israel for betraying the victims of the Holocaust by turning into a kind of colonial power. So, I think this is a kind of dynamic that was quite a strong feature of the late 20th century. So I think those are the factors that have ended up in this situation in the UK and globally, where anti-Semitism and anti-racism are seen as, anti-Semitism and other forms of racism are seen as fundamentally different, and anti-racism has become divorced from anti-Semitism. And so I guess in the final part of my talk, I want to just reflect a little bit about what would it mean to kind of return to that mid-20th century moment, to return to the resources, the intellectual and political resources of that moment, and see anti-Semitism as a form of racism, and whether that could be the kind of grounds for a renewal of anti-racism. And in particular, I think there are two key insights from the forms of critical race scholarship and race critical scholarship that has grown up in that post-war period in the wake of the Parting of the Ways, focused on the investigation and resistance to anti-black racism, that's had two key insights that I think would be enormously helpful for thinking about anti-Semitism. And I suppose the first of these is that racism is much more than prejudice, but it's rather intertwined with practices and structures. So this is a point that's sort of hovering certainly in the work of the Frankfurt School, and with many of the kind of anti-colonial scholars that I mentioned, but in particular kind of flowered in the period after Stokely Carmichael's work in the kind of anti-racist scholarship and activism of the late 20th century. And this is why Kundnani focuses on radical anti-Semitism moving beyond psychology. And so I think the point here is that prejudice and kind of stereotyping, kind of hostility, enmity, negative dispositions are kind of an inadequate way of thinking about racism, which is wired into society. And I think that the kind of mechanisms that scholars have used for understanding how this works focus on ideas like discourse and ideology, which relate these kind of ideas about race to practices in the real world that shape people's kind of concrete practical experiences. And this is a kind of tradition of thought that people like Robert Miles, Avtar Bra have kind of developed. And I won't go through all of these quotations because I'm taking too long, but the summary of them really is that racism is not something which is in our kind of individual heads or hearts, but something which actually structures and shapes the world. Racism is a kind of way of thinking and acting which kind of fundamentally kind of orders people and institutions, regardless of the kind of intent and personal dispositions of the people that kind of participate in that. So it's the idea of a kind of reservoir of discourses and ideologies that we might draw on in our understanding of the world and shaping the kind of political space. And in particular, one of the key ways in which the world is shaped is the idea of race. And this kind of race critical tradition of scholarship based in radical anti-racism argues that racism precedes race. That's the insight that started, I think, with the quote from Boas from 1909 that I had earlier, which understood discrimination, the difference between groups to emerge from discrimination rather than the other way around. My colleague Margarita Aragon says that race, whether understood as elemental difference or pathological prejudice, cannot explain anything, but must itself be explained. That is, race, so the idea of race relations or race riots or kind of there only being racism against groups who are races is a kind of nonsensical idea. It's how does race come into existence is the thing that we need to understand. James Baldwin, Black American writer, in a really important essay from 1984, kind of reflected on what this meant for migrant ethnic groups in America, including Jews. And Baldwin says, no one was white before he or she came to America. It took generations and a vast amount of coercion before this became a white country. It's probable that it's the Jewish community, or more accurately perhaps its remnants, that in America has paid the highest and most extraordinary price for becoming white. For the Jews came here from countries where they were not white, and they came here in part because they were not white. And then he kind of concludes that American Jews, in the eyes of Black America, and not only in those eyes, have opted to become white. So this is a kind of conception of whiteness not as something that might explain racism, as in the kind of ideas of some ideas of kind of white privilege and white supremacy, but rather that whiteness is produced by racism and by the kind of ordering of the world produced by racism. And that it's something that's kind of not a given that precedes racism, but rather that racism precedes race. And I think that the concept, the kind of way of conceptualizing racism that best captures this kind of dynamic process whereby races kind of come into view and out of view is the concept of racialization. This is a term I think that Fanon first used just in passing and was taken up by Michael Banton, who's kind of post-war British sociologist, who wrote, there was a process which can be called racialization, whereby a mode of characterization was developed, applied tentatively in Europe and then more confidently to the populations of the colonial world. So he talks about racialization as a process by which people are kind of categorized into races. This idea was taken up by Robert Miles, who was a more politically and intellectually radical writer, a Marxist perspective, and said that racialization is a term used to capture those instances where social relations between people have been structured by the signification of certain human biological characteristics. That is, certain features of human biology are given significance, given meaning, in such a way as to define and construct differentiated social collectivities. So whereas Michael Banton still spoke about race relations and racial groups and relations between them, Miles argued that we needed to kind of abolish or abandon the idea of race in total, that racialization is something that produces differences, produces collectivities through the kind of arbitrary or meaning being given to arbitrary biological differences. More recently, Nira Yuval Davis defines racialization as a mode of thinking, cultural, ideological, historical, and practice, intersubjective, institutional, and systemic, which constructs, which builds immutable boundaries between groups, which are used to naturalize fixed hierarchical power relations between them. So all of these perspectives, I think, the kind of key insight of the idea of racialization, following from the idea that racism precedes race rather than the other way around, is that kind of biological differences are used, are kind of highlighted, made visible by racism, but cannot be the cause of racial division. So Du Bois, he spoke about the grosser physical differences of colour, hair and bone as arbitrary distinctions which need to be made visible by racism, that those aren't things that we naturally see or naturally give meaning to. We have to kind of learn that through the process of racialization. And I think this is kind of a particularly important insight for thinking about anti-Semitism, particularly in the context of the idea that Jews might be, Baldwin's kind of idea that Jews have become white in some way. And so if you look at the history of anti-Semitism from the medieval period onwards, there's been a kind of huge amount of effort gone into making their difference, making their biological difference visible, whether that's through kind of medieval iconography that portrays them as kind of looking physically different, often with red hair, kind of forcing them to wear different clothes, measuring the kind of noses as the Nazis did, exposing circumcised foreskins, or as today maybe mapping DNA to kind of find the hidden biological difference. So this kind of use of biology to kind of produce difference where there isn't a significant difference is the kind of key point of racialization. And I think this idea of racialization is what underlies the kind of concept or maybe metaphor that David Feldman, Brenda McEver, and I put forward for thinking about anti-Semitism, which is an idea that we kind of rehearsed in this article written in the midst or towards the end of the kind of the Labour anti-Semitism crisis in Political Quarterly. Came out at the beginning of the pandemic, but we haven't kind of set out to kind of fully theorize yet. And I'll just say a few words about kind of how we understand this concept. So what we argue is that anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism, should be understood as a kind of reservoir of myths and narratives and representations and stereotypes which circulate in our culture. They're kind of part of the kind of vocabulary of the cultures that we live within, and at the same time have material effect. So they're not just prejudices or attitudes, they kind of make a difference to people's lives within institutions, within everyday life, or as in the example from the survey at the beginning, in terms of attacks on the street. And we argue that this reservoir is drawn on, whether consciously or unwittingly, by different kinds of social and political actors at different moments. So kind of anti-Semitism has been a feature of all sorts of different kind of political crises over the last centuries. And then fourthly, we suggest that the reservoir is replenished over time, that there are some kind of tropes or myths within it that keep on coming back. Sometimes they appear to be kind of dead and buried. The idea of the Khazars, for example, fashionable in the mid-20th century, that Ashkenazi Jews were actually descended from a Central Asian kingdom and not from the people of Israel, has kind of made a surprising resurgence in the period of the Ukraine war, in kind of anti-Semitic activism in the internet. Other ideas kind of disappear over time. So David Feldman uses the example of the Jewish smell in the Middle Ages. It was widely thought that Jews had a particular smell, and this is not an idea which kind of surfaces today. So the reservoir kind of isn't static, it changes over time. And then I would add that the reservoir is not something which is kind of outside history or outside the social, but it's fundamentally within our culture and is shaped by the kind of social structure of any given time, and it shifts with it, and that's why some elements kind of disappear and new elements emerge. What we didn't really kind of go into in that article, I suppose, was why and how it comes to the surface at particular times, and I'm going to very tentatively tonight suggest maybe three necessary features of when it might rise to the surface. And I think the first one, which we suggest in our article, is that when it's salient. So, for example, if Israel-Palestine is the kind of issue that excites people, then anti-Semitism is kind of often reached for because there's an obvious connection between Jews and Israel. But at other times, for example, to explain why Brexit's been, Brexit was meant to happen, but things haven't fundamentally changed. People kind of look for explanations, and that's the sort of time when anti-Semitism might become salient as a kind of explanation for something that needs explaining. Secondly, when it's kind of available, so in that Khazar example, those ideas are floating around in the kind of extreme right, but they've become available to people because of the way that social media kind of circulates those ideas, and Russian state propaganda kind of picks them up and kind of pumps them into the social media sphere. So anti-Semitism is kind of an available discourse. And then I think also when it's resonant, so different forms of anti-Semitism will resonate with different understandings of the world. So if your understanding of the world is a fundamentally religious one, then kind of religious traditions of anti-Semitism, the Jews as killers of Christ, might resonate with you in a way that it wouldn't resonate for, say, a secular left-wing activist who, however, might kind of find kind of critiques of finance capital resonant. So I think there's a kind of question about what makes features of the reservoir rise to the surface that's a kind of key question for thinking in an anti-racist way about anti-Semitism. So this is my final slide where I conclude basically the kind of argument that I want to take away from this is that an anti-racism which doesn't include anti-antisemitism, an anti-racism, for example, which sets up a binary between real racism on the one hand and anti-Semitism on the other, is both empirically untenable but also kind of intellectually incoherent. And so is an anti-Semitism which doesn't include anti-racism. So people that kind of combat anti-Semitism without placing it in relation to forms of racism. And I think that we should both be, I've argued that I think we should both be aware of and attentive to the history of theorizing racism as providing resources for specifically looking at anti-Semitism, but also vice versa, and that returning to kind of earlier intellectual and activist moments when they were placed in dialogue is a kind of vital grounds for thinking about the renewal of anti-racism and anti-Semitism today. And I think there's kind of maybe 5 kind of manifesto points that would come out of that, which would be the need to step away from the competitive zero-sum playing off of anti-Semitism against other forms of racism that's existed in both movements towards a kind of prioritization of solidarity and common struggle. Second, I think that the heritage of critical race scholarship as a way of moving away from seeing racism as personal prejudice to seeing how it might be socially embedded practice means that we need to shift our focus away from rooting out and blaming anti-Semites towards understanding anti-Semitism. And I think that means prioritizing learning over kind of disciplinary responses, prioritizing self-scrutiny over blame, in the sense that we're all kind of subject to the reservoir of anti-Semitism. So self-scrutiny over blame, but also defensiveness. Third, a need for a kind of more historically grounded understanding of how the reservoir works, how the reservoir changes over time, as a way of informing our ability to recognize anti-Semitism, informing the anti-racist movement's ability to recognize anti-Semitism. Fourth, that requires an understanding of how anti-Semitism works relationally with other forms of racism, as was understood by people like Du Bois. And then finally, a recognition that anti-Semitism has no single natural political home, which is a point that we made in the Political Quarterly article I mentioned. It can come both from its kind of traditional sources, which are very familiar to many in the anti-racist movement, on the its sources on the far right, but it can also emerge on the left and elsewhere. And a focus on left anti-Semitism alone or right-wing anti-Semitism alone will kind of miss the way that the reservoir works in a dynamic way. So that's my final point. So kind of manifesto for solidarity is my concluding point. Thank you very much.